usually order from Upton, but I have gotten some from David's before. Yes, yeah. I used to get it at our co-op, and then one day I was like, "This is stale.
Yeah.
It's been sitting in the
I
bin
know.
too long."
Yeah.
Wow. Two people from my committee are
Oh,
here.
that's
I
nice.
guess.
To support you.
So Representative Smith was
They'll
there
know when I'm
this
making stuff
morning
up.
at Adamant House. He's making his way. He's still going to be late.
Okay.
So he comes late. We'll give him the last couple minutes.
Yeah.
I think there's plenty of information. We're okay.
Okay.
Let's make it.
He's okay though?
I think so. He
Okay.
said that sounds terrifying.
Yeah.
All right. So, good morning, everyone. We will be taking questions for this session. We have some note cards on the tables for you to write your questions down. Due to limited timing, we will be selecting as many as we can to answer. If you have a question written down, please notify us by raising your hand. One of our staff members will come by and pick it up. For those in the back, raise your hand, let us know, we'll get a note card to you. With that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce you all to our speakers and welcome you to our session on soaring home values, a taxing dilemma. My name is Andrea Jimenez, and I'm here with NCSL. It's my pleasure today to introduce you to our speakers. We have Bethany Paquin from the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy joining us. She is a senior research analyst in the Land and Fiscal Systems Impact Area and director of the state-by-state Property Tax at a Glance Data Toolkit. We also have Representative Emily Kornheiser from the Vermont House of Representatives joining us. And our other speaker is Representative Adam Smith from the Kansas House of Representatives. He is running late today, but hopefully makes it and joins us. Anyway, please help us welcome Bethany to the stage.
The Lincoln Institute of Land Policy is a nonprofit private operating foundation that seeks to improve the quality of life through the effective use, taxation, and stewardship of land. We're right next door in Cambridge, so we're really thrilled to have
I don't think your
NCSL
mic is working.
here in Boston.
I don't think your mic is working.
Do we need to adjust the mic? Okay, great. Okay, I will stand closer. States across the country experienced record home growth between 2020 and 2022. And house prices have continued to climb since then, but at a more moderate pace. Before accounting for inflation, housing prices grew 45% nationally just between 2020 and 2022. And even after adjusting for unusually high inflation, prices climbed about 25% on average nationally. Changes in the housing market were uneven across the country, and many states, especially in the Mountain West and South Atlantic, saw even higher price increases. Rapid appreciation in home values boosted homeowners' wealth, but it also fueled concerns about rising property tax bills. And property taxes have also risen since 2020, but not at the same pace as housing prices and more in line with inflation. If we compare changes in the Case-Shiller National Home Price Index to changes in state and local property tax revenue, both indexed to February 2020, the first month of the pandemic, we see that this held true. Keeping in mind that because of the assessment cycles, changes in property taxes can lag changes in value. And the data in this chart on property tax revenue includes revenue from residential and commercial property. All kinds of property. So even though residential prices have risen sharply, the commercial real estate market has softened with the shift to remote work. So growth in total property taxes could obscure some shifting between residential and non-residential property. But in 2019, the average property taxes paid on a median value owner-occupied home in the US were $2,578. By 2023, the median property taxes paid were $3,057. That increase, about 19%, was on pace with inflation over that period. To avoid spikes in property tax bills, local governments need to adjust rates down when property values climb. But a report published this year by Toma Brosi and my Lincoln Institute colleague Adam Langley finds that the extent to which governments adjust rates in response to changes in the tax base varies a lot by state. In some states like Massachusetts, changes in the tax base led to almost no change in the tax levy between 2000 and 2016, but in other states like Oregon and Nevada, a 1% change in assessed values, which are different than market values sometimes, led to a 1% change in the tax levy. This suggests that taxpayers in Massachusetts might not see a proportional increase in their tax levy when values rise, but for homeowners in Oregon and Nevada, growth in assessed values has a lot more direct impact on their tax bill. Still, there's a lot of variation, and the differences we observe in states are partly explained by tax limits, which we'll discuss shortly. So the rapid rise in home values has fueled demands for relief, and the dilemma is how policymakers can respond to taxpayer concerns while preserving the strengths of the property tax, which is the largest source of locally raised revenue for local governments. In 2022, the property tax accounted for 29% of all local general revenue and 70% of local tax revenue. The property tax is the only tax imposed in all 50 states, and in many states, it's the only broad-based tax that local governments can levy. To put property taxes in context, state and local governments raised $649 billion in property tax revenue in 2022. That's more revenue than either state and local individual income taxes or general sales taxes. But the importance of the property tax also varies a lot by state and by region, with the highest reliance right here in the Northeast. The property tax has important strengths that lawmakers should consider when thinking about options for relief. We'll talk about some of the reasons that the property tax has endured as a dominant local source of revenue, but Joan Youngman's book, A Good Tax, which is available for free download on Lincoln Institute's website, is an excellent source that provides a more thorough examination of the strengths of the property tax, and I highly recommend it. Because the real property tax base, which is land and improvements, is immobile, it's very well suited to the needs of local governments. Taxpayers can drive to a bordering town to avoid a local sales tax, and when they move, they take their income with them, but homeowners in a community can't avoid paying property taxes, and if they move, the property tax base stays in that community. Local control is also important. When taxpayers have a say in how their schools and other public services are funded, they're more engaged and are more motivated to approve spending that's worthwhile and to reject wasteful spending. That adds to the efficiency of the tax. Another strength of the property tax is its visibility and transparency. In a healthy property tax system, property taxpayers know how much they pay in property taxes, and importantly, they see a connection between the value of their home, what they pay in property taxes, and the public services they receive. One of the most important strengths of the property tax is its stability. Compared to other broad-based taxes, the property tax is remarkably stable over the business cycle. General sales tax and individual income taxes dip during recessions, while the property tax is comparatively steady. So before we talk about possible answers to the dilemma, how to provide relief without undermining the strengths of the property tax, we'll look at what states are doing now. States have increasingly faced pressure for property tax relief since the beginning of the pandemic, and we saw states expanding property tax relief and enacting new programs throughout 2021, 2022, and 2023. The pandemic had an uneven effect on state and local revenues, but after initial steep declines, by the beginning of 2021, most states' revenue had fully recovered, and many states were taking in more revenue than before the pandemic. In many states, record growth in revenue combined with federal relief funds created large surpluses, and those led to higher spending, higher rainy day fund balances, and tax cuts. But the revenue growth slowed in 2024, and at the same time, federal pandemic aid began to run out, leaving some states with funding gaps. But we've seen that even in this changing fiscal climate, states have continued to enact property tax relief. A handful of states have even seen efforts to eliminate property taxes, but so far none of those have been successful, and the prospect of shifting to another state or local revenue source to replace property taxes has proven very difficult. In the last 5 years, we've seen an uptick in both new property tax limitation and tax limit repeals. Alabama, Texas, and Wyoming adopted new assessment limits, and Nebraska and North Dakota enacted levy limits. Last year, Georgia enacted a limit on assessments for homestead, but they allow local governments to opt out, and according to research from the Tax Foundation, many have, including 68% of Georgia school districts. Colorado, Iowa, Kansas, and Maine all repealed tax limits, but Colorado and Iowa went on to adopt other limits. And several other states, including Kansas, which I hope we'll hear more about today, attempted to enact new tax limits but didn't succeed, and then other states amended their tax limits to make them more stringent. In 2024 and 2025, states responded to demands for tax relief both by enacting new direct relief programs and expanding programs that they already had. 8 states expanded or enacted new homestead exemptions and credits, and 6 states meaningfully expanded relief through circuit breaker programs, which we'll talk about shortly. Representatives Kornheiser and Smith hopefully will be able to tell us more about what happened in Vermont and Kansas, but I want to mention Montana, one of the states that has experienced some of the most rapid appreciation in house prices, because it illustrates the intense pressure states face when property tax rates aren't adjusted down when values rise. In Montana, local property taxes are budget-driven and subject to a levy limit, but the Montana state levied property tax for education is rate-driven. So revenue from the fixed mill state levy soared in 2023 as a result of higher property values. That issue pitted taxpayers and county governments against the state and education groups, and a dispute over whether the state must lower the rate to limit the levy reached the Montana Supreme Court. Ultimately, the court ruled for the state and allowed the fixed mill rate to stand, but Montana has continued to face public pressure, and the legislature since 2023 has adopted several tax relief measures, including earmarking some of that surplus revenue to provide additional aid to local districts to hopefully offset local property tax rates, also providing some homeowner rebates, expanding a circuit breaker program, authorizing monthly property tax payments, and then also restructuring assessment rates to shift the burden of the tax from primary homeowners to second homes and non-residents. So let's talk about what policies states currently have in place. For the purposes of considering policies that respond to broad concerns about rising tax bills, I'll focus on property taxes that have the potential to provide broad relief. Homestead exemptions and credits are the most common form of direct property tax relief for homeowners, and those exist in 33 states. Homestead exemptions reduce taxable value for primary residences by a given percentage or a flat dollar amount, and homestead credits provide a partial credit against the property tax bill. Property tax circuit breakers are available in 31 states, and property tax circuit breakers are cost effective because they target relief to homeowners and sometimes renters whose property tax bill or the rent equivalent of property taxes are high relative to their household income. In other words, households with the highest tax burden. Most circuit breaker programs tie relief to income using either a sliding scale approach in which households in different income brackets qualify for different percentages of relief, or a threshold approach where when property tax bills exceed some set percentage of income, they're offset usually by a credit to the property tax bill, that whole increase or some percentage of it. 31 states allow homeowners to defer property tax payments to ensure that they're not forced out of their homes or in danger of losing their homes because they can't pay their bills. Deferral policies allow qualifying homeowners to postpone payment of property taxes until the property is sold. Typically, these programs are available to senior homeowners who have equity in their homes but have restricted income. Deferrals are unique from the other forms of property tax relief because they don't reduce revenue for local governments. Taxes are paid with interest at the end of the deferral period, so it's just a postponement. But deferrals are often underutilized because homeowners want to avoid leaving a burden for their heirs. States have also turned to truth in taxation requirements as a means of preventing silent tax increases. When property values rise and local governments don't adjust rates down, property tax bills can rise without taxpayers seeing that increase in the tax rate. Truth in taxation or full disclosure policies require local governments to disclose any increase in property tax revenue, whether that is due to the rate increasing or due to the tax base growing. And that has to be disclosed to taxpayers before the budget or the tax rate is adopted. Usually that involves notices to taxpayers and public hearings. 43 states impose some kind of limit on property tax rates, levies, or assessments. These limits vary a lot, and not all of them are binding. We'll briefly discuss the different types of limits states impose, but we're going to focus on assessment limits because of how profoundly they undermine the strengths of the property tax. And keep in mind that it's important to think about how tax limits interact with each other. For example, a rate limit can be binding when it's combined with an assessment limit, and 14 states have both, but a rate limit alone won't constrain growth in the property taxes when assessed values rise. Our database, Significant Features of the Property Tax, provides comprehensive data and summary tables on tax limits in all 50 states. And we have a forthcoming report that provides analysis and comparative data that will be published later this year. Property tax rate limits are the oldest type of limit, and they restrict growth in the property tax rate for in either individual local governments like cities or the overall rate of all overlying tax jurisdictions. Levy limits, on the other hand, restrict growth in total property tax revenue raised. In the 28 states with levy limits, growth is usually restricted by a fixed percentage or by inflation, or sometimes the lesser of a fixed percentage or inflation. And many rate and levy limits do include override provisions so that local governments have the option to approve spending over the limit, usually by a referendum. Instead of limiting growth in the rate or the amount raised by the property tax, assessment limits restrict growth in assessed values of individual properties. 16 states have broad assessment limits, and instead of allowing assessed values to follow market value, assessment limits will restrict growth to a set percentage that can range from 2%, like in California, to 10%, like in Texas. And sometimes the rates vary depending on the type of property. When market values exceed these growth percentages, the assessed value is capped. And in most of these states, property is then reassessed at market value only when it's sold. The predictability that assessment limits can provide, especially when they're paired with a rate limit, might be appealing to taxpayers and policymakers when property values climb, but their unintended consequences undermine the strengths of the property tax and sometimes even exacerbate the very issues that they aim to solve. Florida's Save Our Homes limit has kept assessment increases at 3% or inflation since the 1990s, but Florida's facing growing pressure for relief, sparking fears of a tax revolt and calls to replace the property tax with less stable, less efficient alternatives. Assessment limits cause sharp disparities in the taxation of equivalent properties. They've greatly reduced the tax for long-term homeowners, but new purchasers bear the burden, and that can lead to political upheaval. Together with the Minnesota Center for Fiscal Excellence, we just released our annual 50-state property tax comparison study. That compares effective tax rates of over 100 cities. So the effective tax rate is calculated by, calculated as actual property taxes paid as a percentage of market value. And this table from the report shows the ratio of effective tax rates on a median value home. So a ratio of 1 means that the effective tax rate on a newly purchased home is the same as on a home owned for the average duration in that city. You can see how dramatic the differences can be. In California and Florida, under their assessment limits, owners of new homes pay twice to almost 3 times the amount of property taxes on a median value home as their neighbors who have owned a home the average length of time. That inequality has fueled much of the taxpayer discontent in places like Florida. Assessment limits also create a lock-in effect because homeowners are more reluctant to sell and relocate when they stand to lose their reduced assessed value. So by severing the link between a taxpayer's home value, what they pay in taxes, and the public services they receive. The assessment limits undermine the transparency of the property tax. They also hamper local control and can force local governments to shift responsibility for services to state governments or fund them with alternative revenue sources that come with their own challenges. Possible answers. Homestead exemptions are one example of a policy that addresses taxpayer concerns without undercutting the benefits of the property tax. Flat dollar exemptions can even make the distribution of the property tax more progressive. For example, if a state offers a flat $10,000 homestead exemption to all homeowners, for a $100,000 home, that's a 10% reduction in assessed value. But for a $400,000 home, that's only a 2.5% reduction in value. We have an example of a homestead exemption right here in Boston. So local governments in Massachusetts can opt to offer an exemption that's equal to 35% of the average assessed home value. So for Boston, where home values are really high, the exemption was $331,241 in fiscal year 2024. For a savings of up to $3,600 on the tax bill. So, but even considering Boston's high property values, that's a very generous exemption. However, research shows that even a modest homestead exemption can provide relief and achieve greater progressivity in the distribution of the property tax. Many of the property tax relief options I mentioned today are considered in more detail in our report, Property Tax Relief for Homeowners. And I think you have policy briefs based on that report at your table, but the full report is also available for download on our website. So as your states face increasing pressure for property tax relief, the dilemma for legislators is how to provide relief while maintaining an equitable and efficient tax system. To address taxpayer concerns without undermining transparency, stability, the efficiency of the property tax, local governments need to adjust rates down when values rise. Well-designed property tax relief can also help address concerns from taxpayers about rising property tax bills and fairness. Flat dollar homestead exemptions are a possible answer because they can provide broad relief and make the distribution of the property tax more progressive. States should avoid assessment limits, but truth in taxation is a promising tool, and we've seen evidence that these policies can effectively limit growth without undermining local control or creating the inequities that we see from assessment limits. And I know both Vermont and Kansas have explored many of these options over the last session or two, and we're really fortunate to be able to hear about their experiences firsthand, so I will turn it over to Representative Kornheiser.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Emily Kornheiser. I'm the Revenue Chair in Vermont's House of Representatives, and I am lucky that two of my colleagues from the Ways and Means Committee are here today, and so I hope that they forgive me for brushing over some very deep areas in an effort to stay within some time here. The first time I got really excited about property valuation was actually at NCSL in 2019 at a panel with the Lincoln Institute, and I have been using their resources ever since, and I've been really grateful for the deep dive into the pros and cons over a really broad swath of policy. I think one of the reasons that this particular work is so exciting, but also so hard, especially for legislators, is that I love my home. I don't know about all of you. Like, I love it like a person sometimes. And I don't feel that way about my bank account or my paycheck or really anything else in my life that's tied to dollars. And I know that's not true just for me. That's true for my constituents. It's true probably for a lot of you in this room. And so the work is very emotional. The property valuation is very emotional. The property tax bill is very emotional. And sort of the risks that humans and our constituents feel around property taxes can be very emotional. And so it makes this work much harder, and it makes sort of having conversations about the precision and the stability of the tax code feel even more tone deaf than some other tax policy conversations can feel, which are often tone deaf. So in Vermont, we are a state that honestly has not changed all that much in the last 300 years. We had our first property taxes to fund our local community schools, and that was essentially levied by adding up the value of the sheep that folks had. Vermont was almost entirely covered in sheep with very few trees not that long ago. And so folks were essentially like taxed one sheep out of whatever, 50 sheep, and that's how they paid their property taxes. And over the last many, many years, very few people have sheep anymore. A couple have cows, but most people have paychecks and homes. And what value and how value is measured for our property has changed so very much. I'm going to be talking about property taxes in relationship to just education taxes. In Vermont, we levy a statewide education property tax in order to fully fund all of our schools. We do not have a local education tax, and our local municipal taxes are a totally different thing that I fortunately never have to touch. Since the mid-90s, we have levied this statewide education tax to fully fund all of our schools, though those budget decisions, until some decisions we made this year, the budget decisions were made locally. So a local district could decide to spend whatever it wanted, and then we would levy enough taxes every single year statewide to fund each of those different district decisions. In the last 2 years, what was once a real opportunity for fulsome funded schools and really profound tax fairness got quite out of control for a few reasons. One, the need for school spending skyrocketed post-pandemic, and I think that was true in a lot of our communities, but we didn't really have a circuit breaker built into that spending. Our property valuations skyrocketed all over as a result of pandemic-era migration into Vermont as folks left cities like Boston and New York and wanted to live somewhere a little further away from people. We have the most second homes as a percentage of our residential stock, or the second most. We go back and forth with Maine on that. But some estimates are that 45% of our residential housing stock is non-primary homes right now. And so that drives up property values in profound ways, with folks paying cash for maybe a fourth home that's right next door to someone who might have bought their home in the 60s to raise a family. Because we set our tax rates every year in Vermont freshly, that is tied to local valuations, community to community, town by town, and those valuations historically have changed town by town. Some towns in Vermont 2 years ago had not reappraised in 20 years, 30 years, and then some had just done it. And so you saw, look at your faces, right? It's wild, it is wild we were living that way. And so we actually have a statewide adjuster that we call the common level of appraisal that would adjust each property tax value in communities in relationship to their tax rates to try to equalize that, so that communities that had not appraised in 30 years were not having this huge advantage over towns that just did it the year before. But that is not how taxpayers experienced it. And as I said at the beginning, this is very emotional stuff. And we had this very nerdy, complicated mathematical formula that no one could understand when they got their scary, scary tax bill. So we saw skyrocketing spending, skyrocketing valuation. We did have a system where we could adjust our rates downward when valuations went up. We did that every single year. But that wasn't enough for, frankly, the political moment we were in. And so we knew we were really driven as legislators this last biennium to do something about property taxes. However, we had a system that had been built in the 90s that was so tightly wound together with all those mathematical formulas that we couldn't make any small tweaks. We couldn't adjust our homestead exemptions because we actually didn't have a homestead exemption. We had an income-based property tax rate. We couldn't add inflators to what values of property would be eligible for relief because that would cause tax rate to rise to people who could least afford it. And so we really needed to step back and rebuild our property tax system from the ground up. And that's what we did this last biennium. And if anyone wants to look it up, it's Act 73 of 2025 in Vermont. We also, at the same time of this inconsistent valuation, rising spending, rising values, very slow housing build out, we also have way fewer kids in Vermont than we had 20 years ago. Some towns had half the number of kids in their schools that they had 20 years ago. And frankly, Vermont's on the bleeding edge of something that's going to happen all across America. And so, like, welcome and start thinking about it. You have more time than we did. So we were able to take this opportunity, though, to really step back and say, what is the property tax system we want to have in Vermont? How progressive do we want it to be? How sensitive to changing property values from community to community? Some of these communities that are really resort communities, we're having a very different experience than way more rural communities, which might have farms. But we still wanted to completely fund our schools. And so we did a few things with our tax relief. As I said, under a previous law, most homestead property taxpayers were eligible for something that looked like a property tax credit, but it was actually an income-based property tax rate. We removed that and instead added a property tax credit that establishes a homestead exemption, essentially reduces the value that is under taxation, and that goes up to almost 100% for very low-income folks. And is up to house values of $425,000, which is the vast majority of homes in Vermont, and up to a quite high income limit. We also added inflators into the bill. I don't know about all of you, if we don't add inflators at the get-go, it is so hard and so expensive to go back in and add it later. And so one of my goals as a revenue chair is whenever we touch something, we're putting an inflator in and letting the future legislators just deal with that. We kept our existing municipal circuit breaker. We didn't touch that, but we removed the property tax circuit breaker, the education property tax circuit breaker, in favor of this really full curve that would enable middle-class families to get a big property tax discount, but also quite poor families get a big property tax discount. So we had that tier step down that exempted the vast majority of value, and we also changed our rate system. So we used to have just a non-homestead rate and a homestead rate. A homestead rate's the rate for folks who live somewhere. We changed it so we have a uniform property tax rate across all properties, but we set a ratio system. So a homestead would have one ratio, a non-homestead, like a commercial property or an apartment building, would have a second ratio, and we set a third ratio for second homes. And that was really exciting because, one, it means we can set that rate every year as values go up and down. So we're not stuck in with a rate as values go up and raising too much money. We're just raising the amount we need to raise. But those really hard conversations, those very hard political conversations about should apartments have higher taxes than second homes, than people's homes, we get to figure out those political discussions in just a single year instead of having to rehash them every year. So in this new system, we are still fully funding our schools, but we have fixed payments to districts so that we have consistent property taxes year over year. That's very important for sort of the emotional content of people's lives, but also for folks' ability to pay their bills. We have property tax relief that's adjusted by inflation and also adjusted both people's incomes and property values. And we set up a new system of regional property appraisals so that this whole system of every 30 years versus every single year is over. All properties are going to be appraised every 5 years, and the state is going to supervise that reappraisal so we don't have the variations between tiny towns, big towns. Someone has a feeling about the hill next door and how it's sort of the other side of the train tracks and not so good. And so we really we took it all apart, we put it back together. Right now, today, a few months later, I'm exhausted. I think we're all exhausted. There's been a lot of political blowback, but I think we have a much fairer system that's ready for us to step into the future with, and likely will need to be tweaked as we go, but it's a system that we set up to be tweakable to respond to the future. So thank you all very much, and I appreciate you listening to all that complexity shoved into 5 minutes, and I can't wait to hear about your state, which I think is quite different from Vermont.
listening to you two ladies speak, I just want to give you applause for everything that you've said and everything that you've accomplished. I'm Adam Smith. I'm the tax chair in the Kansas House of Representatives. I've been in there for about 6 years as tax chairman. Over that amount of time, we have dealt with income tax, we've dealt with sales tax, some major sales tax policy, and now we're trying to tackle property tax when we have no money left. So it's kind of interesting because when you hit the campaign trail, everybody talks about property tax. Very few people talk about income tax or sales tax, and it seems to be property tax seems to be one of the hardest ones to get some really valuable policy passed. We all want to reduce it, but we all have different ideas on how we're going to accomplish that. And so it really creates, as you said, I loved your comment about how property tax is one of the taxes that has the most emotion tied to it, and that's really accurate. I'm going to try to be concise as possible, just so we can have some time to get to questions. First of all, I apologize. I was late. My ride share was involved in an accident on the way here, so everybody was okay. It was a very minor accident, but it made a huge traffic mess. So I was a little frazzled, but I made it. So first of all, I want to give you a little snapshot on what state government looks like in Kansas, because I think that might explain a little bit of the challenges that we have. Currently, the legislature, both chambers, has supermajority Republican control. That's pretty historic in Kansas as far as traditionally, because the Kansas Senate has been under Republican control since 1917. That's 1917, not 2017. The House of Representatives has been under control of the Republicans since 1992, and 92 is really kind of a blip. It was under control for a lot of years. So predominantly, the legislature in Kansas is elected as Republicans. Not true with the governor's office. We have, since 1957, almost like clockwork. It's a pendulum. We elect a governor, we elect a Republican. We elect a governor, or a Democrat, we elect a Republican. We always elect a governor, we do. But it creates some interesting dynamics in sometimes what the legislature, when we can get together and we focus on an idea, what happens once we pass that bill and it gets to the governor's office. We are currently in the 7th year of a Democrat governor, and we have had to override a lot of vetoes regarding tax policy. But that wasn't the issue this year. The issue was actually between the House and the Senate. We all wanted to reduce property taxes. We just had very different ideas on how to accomplish that. So I'll go into a little bit about what we tried to do and what did not happen, and then I'll explain quickly what we did get passed. First of all, we tried, and you heard a lot of the details about these from the Land Institute. The Senate adopted it was a Senate concurrent resolution. It was a constitutional amendment to put in an assessment limit, a 3% fixed assessment limit that was also not only was it the limit, but it was retroactive back to values of 2022. Right before the housing spike happened in Kansas as well as across the country. As I'm sure you're all aware, you're all dealing with that in every state. As you heard, some of the things that people think when they see that it's going to be a 3% assessment limit, they translate that in their mind to mean, oh, my property taxes are only going to go up 3%, right? Mm-hmm. Not true, because in Kansas we do not have a levy limit. So as local governments set their budget, we're very much similar to Vermont. The state government is pretty much out of the property tax equation. It's cities and counties and schools that set their property taxes and levy the property tax. We do have a 20 mil statewide levy that is for the schools, but then we also allow a local option budget. But as they adopt their budgets, if they are restricted in their evaluation, what happens to the mill levy? The mill levy just goes up. You don't actually see any property tax relief. So that was some of the arguments. The Senate passed their resolution 27-13. It is a constitutional amendment, so it needed 2/3 vote, so it needed 27 votes. It got 27 votes. When it came over to the House, we had the same kind of concerns that you heard about from the Lincoln Land Institute. It failed 37-88. we took the idea, if we were going to work on some type of an assessment limit, rather than having a fixed percentage, the House of Representatives came up with the concept of using an averaging system. It kind of avoids that tax shift because each parcel can essentially balance within itself over a number of years. We developed a policy that would create an assessment limit based on a 6-year average, and we do annual reassessments in Kansas, and it's across the board. Everybody has to do those. Whether or not all counties and county appraisers are doing it accurately is always up for debate, but at least the rules say they're supposed to do that. That resolution, if you're taking notes, it was House Resolution 5011. That passed the House 117-4, but it was never considered by the Senate. So toward the end of session, we realized that assessment limits weren't going anywhere. So I sat down with several members of the House Tax Committee, and we came up with a different concept. It was a property tax relief fund. It was basically an incentive-based fund that would take it would analyze the annual budget and the required property taxes from each city, school, and county, and take a look at what they levied the last year and add a multiplier in. We had a factor that was inflation, it was CPI, plus we allowed for new growth. We have several communities in Kansas. It's predominantly a rural state, a lot of very, very older homes, older communities, but we do have several areas in Kansas that are growing very rapidly. So we put in a factor that allowed them to account for any new valuation. So it would include that new growth. You wouldn't be just limited to CPI. Then if the local governments elected to stay within those parameters on their tax increase that they required when they passed their budget, they would qualify for their distribution from this state fund. If they exceeded that, they lost the eligibility to receive that distribution. Plus, if they exceeded it by too much, it went to the voters. So the voters ultimately would have control over whether or not that property tax, if there's a big need in the community, maybe it's a law enforcement center, maybe it's a hospital, I'm not sure what all the different things could be, but maybe that community says, yes, we've got a proposed 7% increase in property taxes, but it's necessary. We wanted to leave the voters and the local officials that flexibility to do so if they wanted to, but ultimately the voters would have the final control over very sharp increases in taxes. That measure passed the House. That was House Bill 2396. It passed the House 115-6. It was never considered by the Senate. So we worked a lot and we didn't get much done in Kansas, but here's what we did agree on and what we did get accomplished. The state for probably about 40 to 50 years, I think, has levied 1.5 mils for our educational building funds and our state institutions, basically our universities and our state hospitals. We decided to remove that. It was a 1.5 mil levy. We removed that. We're making that into an appropriation and taking that off of trying to get the state out of the property tax business. We still do have the 20 mils that we levy for schools. That's collected at the state, but then it's distributed back to the local school districts for their use on how they use that money. So we've got a lot of work still yet to do in Kansas. Hopefully we can kind of come together and find some areas where we can agree and get some more property tax relief. But I think I'll go ahead and end there to leave as much time as we can for questions if possible.
All right, so we do have a question from Delaware. Just a reminder, raise your hand. We'll come by and pick up your note card just due to limited time. Someone from Delaware asked for suggestions on how state legislators can approach their counties in tax and reassessment issues when each county in the state is in charge of their own tax collection.
Let me know if this doesn't answer the question, but frequent and regular high-quality assessments are absolutely essential for fairness in a property tax system. And the state can play a role. I think you mentioned some administrative reforms in Vermont, and the state can play a role in setting standards for assessments, and that will translate into fairer property taxes in communities.
Another audience member asks, can you speak to the merits or negatives of a land value tax, given the land and improvements of the calculations?
Yes, so land value taxation is something that we think a lot about at the Lincoln Institute, and the concept holds a lot of promise because a tax on land is fairer in some ways than taxing improvements, and also taxing improvements can shifting the tax to land versus improvements can promote development. That's a whole topic that we could have an entire other session on, but I will say that it has been tried in different places. There are some communities in Pennsylvania. It's been discussed in Detroit as a possible solution to some of the issues Detroit is facing, and we do have a report about Detroit, and it goes into a lot of detail about land value taxation and some of the possible benefits from that. So I would highly recommend, if you have an interest in that, to look into our resources and specifically the report on Detroit.
I would just add, we did have a lot of conversations about land value tax. It was something that was brought up really across the political spectrum as a sexy new idea that people got excited about. In Vermont, it would be really hard because essentially it would wind up increasing property taxes in rural areas while reducing them in more urban areas, which is really the opposite direction that voters wanted us to be going in. But the questions that get unearthed when discussing a land value tax, I think are really valuable questions for our committee to be having, and I think for any property tax system to be having. And so I think regardless if you think it's a final direction to go into, I think it really unearths questions we needed to be answering regardless.
All right, and we have time for one last question. Our speakers may be able to stay a little bit after, and you can ask any questions you have to them individually. How can states balance tax credits for seniors on fixed incomes to ensure they aren't priced out of their homes without harming the state, county tax revenues?
One thing that we do in Kansas, and that's one of the things that's on my to-do list for next session, is trying to reevaluate our circuit breaker programs, because we have some very robust programs. However, they haven't been touched in about 20 years. So the fixed numbers, I loved what you put in there as far as the natural inflation or growth factors in there. We didn't have that. We have fixed dollar amounts. $500 back in the 90s doesn't mean what it used to. So we're going to be taking a look at that to see how we can protect some of those seniors, maybe create a graduated, like the older you get, the more of a property tax discount you get, because as my friend said, homes are very emotional. You put a lot of time and money and effort and blood, sweat, and tears into those homes. When you're old, we don't want to tax you out of your home. So we do need to look at improving more relief for seniors.
I have a lot of questions about tax relief just for seniors. I think older folks are on fixed incomes. I think there's also a lot of younger folks that are on fixed incomes. I think a lot of older folks have paid off their mortgages and might have a much greater ability to pay their property tax than some younger folks do. And so as we look at property tax relief, I try to make sure that it's about ability to pay and not any particular characteristics of a person.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Age isn't always a great indicator of ability to pay or resources, but some of the tools we talked about, property tax circuit breakers, for example, that provide relief based on property taxes as a percentage of income or income level, those are, some states, they're just for seniors, but those programs target to where the need is, regardless of the age of the taxpayer. And also, we talked a little bit about deferrals, but you asked about people being taxed out of their homes. States with deferral programs, it's almost like a reverse mortgage, but seniors who don't want to leave their homes and affordability is an issue with their tax bill, they can defer payment until the tax is sold, so that keeps them from feeling like they're forced out of their homes.
Thank you. Please help me thank our wonderful speakers today.